Welcome to Dialogue. I'm your host, Rebekah Sebastian, and today we are concluding the series about the imbalance of media coverage for victims of color, which I've been calling Missing, Murdered, and the Media. Today's guest is another member of said media. Jonquilyn Hill is a journalist and the host of the podcast Through the Cracks. I listened to this last year during what was, I guess, phase 2 of the pandemic, and it quickly became one of my favorite shows. Jonquilyn is also a senior producer at 1A, which is the news show from WAMU and NPR. Jonquilyn and I discuss the little girl at the heart of Season 1's Through the Cracks, Relisha Rudd, and the systems, including the media, that failed her. We also had an unexpected reckoning about the racial divide within the true crime genre. Jonquilyn is a delight. I loved her perspective on the subject that we've been exploring over the course of 4 weeks, and I'm so grateful to her and all the guests who have weighed in over the last month. You can find a link to Jonquilyn's Twitter, her news show, and her podcast Through the Cracks in the show notes. With that, let's get to the conversation and kill the small talk.
Ever since the pandemic started, I've noticed people checking in on me more than usual. A text from an old coworker I haven't seen in a while. A video chat with high school friends just to see how life is going. All of these connections remind me that if something were to happen to me, if I went off the radar for just one day, someone would notice. This is what I think about every time I think about Relisha Rudd.
Relisha.
Relisha lived in a homeless shelter in Washington, D.C. with her family. She loved bike races with her 3 little brothers, doing arts and crafts after school, and her favorite cartoon was Dora the Explorer.
The shelter give us some place to stay.
Good. And now you say to her, and that's good.
Say it louder.
Say to her, and that's good.
You on the screen.
No, Danielle's listening.
In 2014, when she was just 8 years old, Relisha Rudd went missing. But it took 18 days before her family knew something was wrong. Everyone thought that she was with someone different, a family member, or a trusted friend.
You know your granddaughter Relisha Rudd is missing. No, she's not. Yes, she is, ma'am. No, she's not. She's with Khalil Tatum.
Mr. Wheeler, you know where your daughter is? Yeah, she at Ashley's house. They said, are you sure?
From that moment, that's when I found out that she was missing. I didn't even know that she was gone.
I'm Jonquilyn Hill, and from WAMU and PRX, this is Through the Cracks, a podcast about the gaps in our society and the people who fall through them.
While we're all a bit relieved that we did not find Relisha here the way we anticipated we would find her, it's heart-wrenchingly frustrating that we don't have answers as to where she is right now.
This season on Through the Cracks, how the district lost a girl, the story of Relisha Rudd. When the D.C. government investigated how Relisha went missing, they, quote, did not find evidence that these tragic events were preventable. So that's what we're looking into on this podcast. How could a child, with an extended family network, teachers, and social workers all looking out for her, just disappear?
How can you have a young girl abducted at a shelter that's run by the city, and apparently she's taken by an employee of the city who works at this shelter? How does that happen before anyone notices?
We have safety nets to try to prevent eviction, but they aren't enough.
Do we value the lives of poor Black children? And if so, what's the evidence of that? And what are we willing to do to truly make sure that this cannot happen again?
Relisha, if you hear us, we want you to know that we will never, ever stop searching for you.
Listen to Through the Cracks on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Jonquilyn, welcome to Dialogue Podcast. So excited to talk to you tonight.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Well, I discovered you and your work through what became one of my favorite podcasts, Through the Cracks, about the story of a little girl named Relisha Rudd, whose case is technically active, though it's gone a bit cold. She is considered missing. And the story has just so many wild elements to it. And it's under this series about people who fall through the cracks. I would love to hear in your own words what that series is about and how you came to discover and cover Relisha's story, and give us the background about it.
Yeah, so Through the Cracks is a podcast that focuses on the safety net that's supposed to be there to protect the most vulnerable people in DC. And when that fails, when people fall through. So Relisha was an 8-year-old second grader living at a shelter in DC with her family when she disappeared. She was staying at this place called DC General Family Shelter. It was a former hospital that was abandoned and turned into a family shelter. And the conditions that they were living in weren't great. And one of the things that her parents did to kind of alleviate her having to be there was leave her in the care of a janitor that worked at the shelter. And he was the last person she was seen with before she disappeared. He was later found dead, as was his wife. And to this day, we still don't know what happened to Relisha. And, you know, I was living in DC. I've lived in DC for over a decade now, which is so crazy. And I was living in DC when this happened. And the story was everywhere in the local news. And then after a period of time, it faded. But her story still stuck with me in this really real way. And I wanted to talk about it because her story is less known than, like, you know, everyone knows JonBenet Ramsey's name, but people don't know Relisha Rudd's name.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that struck me, I think, is it's a beautiful little girl. Her parents or her main caregivers were suspects and people of interest, you could say. And were they responsible for what happened? Same with JonBenet Ramsey. The differences here we have are socioeconomic, race. Why do you think it is that her story didn't really transcend DC metro area?
Yeah, I think race is a factor. You know, we all have kind of heard about, especially if you're familiar with true crime, you hear about what's called missing white woman syndrome, that, you know, a blonde white woman, a blonde, pretty, thin white woman, able-bodied white woman goes missing. And everyone's like, oh, we need to figure out what's happening, which is good. But you know, if you don't fall into all of those categories, your story is less likely to be told. And I think also privilege and money has something to do with it, because if you have money for attorneys and private investigators and PR, you know how to get the word out. You have connections. It's easy to get that conversation going versus if you're navigating the system. And maybe, you know, you come from a community where you're uncomfortable going to the police with something in the first place. So even getting that attention on there is difficult. So it's a lot of factors that lead to who gets the attention and who doesn't.
Right. And for Relisha in particular, and your podcast in particular, it's a lot about the systemic failures that occurred. And I'm wondering if you consider the media one of those systems, and if whether you do or don't. And then additionally, how did the media help her story, and how do you think it maybe hurt her story?
Yeah, I definitely consider the media one of the institutions that failed Relisha. And I even later on this season, we get kind of meta about, like, okay, I am part of the media. What does it mean for us to cover this? And you know, how are we talking about it? On one hand, I think there can be a sensational element, and it's very easy, especially when you first hear the story, you don't hear their background, to put all of the blame on her family. And I think that's a little where it gets sticky. And, you know, that's not to say that there were not things that could have gone differently and should have gone differently. But when you realize, like, the amount of trauma that every single person involved in the story experienced, you're just like, oh my God, like it can feel a little despondent, like, wow, nobody had a chance. And of course, you know, you hope that's not true. You hope that, like, people do have a chance, but it can really feel that way. And I think it's really interesting the role media plays in all of this, because on one hand, people who have loved ones go missing need that, because it gets attention. It gets people looking. It has people being like, oh, I know that little girl. I will keep an eye out for her. But it also opens up families and so many different things to so much scrutiny that can really tear them apart.
And possibly, thwart an investigation or assistance that they need. Their story did break wide open in a oft forgotten, at least for me, daytime talk show that I didn't know about called the Steve Wilkos Show. So they did get this national coverage through the platform of this show, which was, those shows are very ratings driven. So what did you make when you learned that the family, her mom in particular, were on the show, and how do you feel they treated the story?
Yeah, it was really interesting. When I first started reporting in earnest, I was like, okay, let me look at other media coverage from that time, see if anything was missed. And one of the first things that popped up was this interview with Steve Wilkos on the Steve Wilkos Show. He previously was Jerry Springer's bodyguard, and then eventually, got more attention from that and got his own show. And I think if you're not familiar with Steve Wilkos, which I was not until I saw the clip, you are familiar with Jerry Springer and kind of the spectacle of that show. And, I'm not above the spectacle, whether it's daytime talk or reality TV. I'm into it. Like I know what's going on with Married at First Sight, and I can admit that part of the reason I know is because it's a spectacle. But it made me uncomfortable because it was a period of time where, and there still is some infighting within the family, but there was a lot of infighting going on with the family in her wake. You could tell that the tragedy really took its toll and continues to take its toll on them. And there's this instance where Wilkos tells Relisha's mother, Shamika, that she isn't a good mother. And it made me reflect a lot about motherhood and how motherhood is portrayed, and in particular Black motherhood is portrayed. Because I think a lot of the times when something happens to a child, the first thought is like, where was the mom? Like, what's going on? And while that, I think it's very valid, and I don't have kids yet, but just like I have friends who are starting to have their first kids. And even talking with my mom as the podcast was being developed, there is like something in you that typically is like, okay, like this child is my responsibility now. They come first. But it was just so ugly. And it also felt like I had to look at this conflict that was happening within a family that I was not supposed to see. It felt very much like this is a fight that should be happening behind closed doors and not on daytime television.
Oh, yeah. It's so raw. And yeah, you definitely feel like you're not supposed to be a part of it. And your point about motherhood is great. And I think for sure that burden falls more deeply on probably Black mothers and Latina mothers. But I think mothers in general, like the minute we mess up, people just love to vilify us. I'm saying us, I am a mother. And like no one feels the guilt of a mistake made than a mother. I mean, there's already so much inherent struggle with the role. It reminds me of something my sister-in-law said though when her kids were little, which is when everybody's watching the baby, nobody's watching the baby. But I thought, that could be kind of the feeling going on in Relisha's family, which was more than just a single mom and her mother. She had a partner. There was aunts, grandmothers. There was also after school programs. Like there were so many pieces to Relisha's net of people that were supposed to care for her that if I want to be generous, and there is the instinct in me that's like, oh God, like, yeah, who did drop the ball? Part of me is also like, that's confusing too when there's a lot of moving parts caring for a child.
Yeah, I think of it, I explained it early in the podcast, almost kind of like, the movie Home Alone, where there are just so many kids and so many things going on and all these missteps. And it's like, it's not until just so much later that you realize like, wait, where's that kid? And it was sort of like that. Like I think there's this group that did after school care at the shelter. They still do playtime with kids experiencing homelessness in DC. It's a really great organization called the Homeless Children's Playtime Project. And Relisha, she was 8, and that's kind of the age where oh, you're not a little kid anymore. You're going to be a big kid. So she was transitioning. She was about the age where you start to transition into the preteen program.
Yeah.
And so, you know, she wasn't with the little kids. And so they thought, oh, she's with the preteens. Like she made that jump. That's great. Meanwhile, she's never been with the preteens and they have no idea to keep track of that. So it's just all of these moving parts. It's like, oh, like her mom said she's at her aunt's house, or like, oh, her aunt says she's with her mom, or like grandma says that Khalil Tatum, who's the janitor she was last seen with, is like taking her for the weekend. So, and like staying with his granddaughter. So there were so many cooks in the kitchen.
Yes.
That the responsibility never fell on one person. And that includes the school too. Like the school's being told like, oh, she's with a doctor. Like, all right, if she's with a doctor, fine. So it's just like all these different moving parts.
Which is particularly heartbreaking too, because that's sort of what it should be. Mothers should not be bearing this responsibility alone, or even a couple if you're a partner.
Yeah.
You know, it's like it should take a village, not to sound cliche, but then there are breakdowns in even that kind of setup. And I don't think we've explicitly stated that she was missing for several weeks before officially declared missing, right? How long?
Right. She was missing for 18 days before the city realized. And that's, again, if you're into true crime, you know, like sort of those first hours are so important.
Oh my God. Critical.
And the more time passes, the bleaker the circumstances get.
Hey everyone, Rebekah here. It's that time again. We are gearing up for CrimeCon 2022. This year, the event will be held in Las Vegas, and the dates are April 29th to May 1st. I am already hard at work prepping my table for Podcast Row, and I'm involved in a couple of other exciting aspects of the event, and I really hope to see you there. Now, if you use the code DIALOGUE, that's DIEALOGUE, you'll get 10% off your regular standard pass. So go to crimecon.com to register, and again, use this code DIALOGUE, DIEALOGUE, for 10% off your pass. I hope to see you in Vegas.
Say their name. We are back with season 2 of Say Their Name, as we hear from families who have been impacted by the assault and killing of Black people by police and in stand your ground states. More stories, more families, more voices, more lives impacted.
In the case of John Horton, they've been outspoken in the negligence of the prison guards.
Reckless manslaughter.
As anticipation builds before the verdict in the Sean Bell shooting death trial.
Big update about the Prince George's County officer who shot and killed a man inside his police cruiser. He's now been charged with murder in the death of William Green.
22-year-old Stephon Clark was fatally shot. He was shot 8 times in his grandmother's backyard.
Sharing stories of women who have also lost their lives at the hands of police violence.
44-year-old Pamela Turner was shot and killed. Her family has been very vocal since this shooting last May. They say she suffered from a mental illness, and they demanded charges be filed.
The families of Betty Jones demanding justice and answers from the Chicago Police Department.
There's been a major development in the police shooting of 22-year-old African-American woman Rakia Boyd.
There's nobody out here protecting my sisters. They just letting my sisters be in continuously being stripped away. There's nobody talking about them.
Tensions very high in a Baltimore County courtroom as the civil trial for Corinne Gaines continues to play out.
The sisters of the woman who was shot and killed by Capitol Police, they're giving us a clearer picture of Miriam Carey, a mother. Her sisters argue she did not deserve to die.
This mob on January 6th that stormed the Capitol for actually giving egress. They moved the same type of gate that was being held against my sister's car to try to prevent her from driving away.
We are back with season 2 of Say Their Name. Tune in January 3rd. Until truth and justice is obtained, we will always say their name.
Yeah, offline we talked a little bit about true crime, and I'm just curious, you were talking about being part of the media. So how do you critique it, participate in it, and all of that? And that's my dilemma being in true crime, is like, there's so much about it. I love JonBenet Ramsey being one of the cases that got me into it. But I also do critique it. And I also do see the problems with the genre. How do you perceive true crime? And also in relation to this podcast you made, did you imagine it to be in the true crime genre? Where did you see it fitting into that landscape?
Yeah, so I've been a true crime fan, oh my gosh, like for so long. I mean, you know, you grow up and your parents are watching Law and Order. Or I think of the JonBenet Ramsey case, like she and I, if she were still alive, we would be the same age. She might even be a couple months older. So I remember that case so distinctly because my mom was just like so horrified, just like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine. Like my child's around the same age. There was that. And it's really interesting because I always knew Through the Cracks was a true crime podcast. But I also think it benefits from being created at this particular point in time because I think the way we think about true crime has changed. Like it used to be very much like there is a crime, we're going to figure it out. Either it's unsolved or the police figured it out. And now I think we're in a place where true crime also looks at the processes. It's like, okay, where's the breakdown in the justice system? I think of In the Dark season 2 and Curtis Flowers, or I think of the Exonerated Five, who used to be known as the Central Park Five. And it's like, it's also sort of this referendum on our justice system and policing. And so I think those conversations in true crime are changing. And then it can get really sensational really quickly. And when we were developing the podcast, Daisy Rosario, who was the senior producer over at WAMU at the time, now she's over at Stitcher and Sirius XM. She had us also make a list of what we did not want to sound like. And one podcast in particular that came up, it's a really good podcast and I highly recommend, but it's a parody of true crime podcast called A Very Fatal Murder, which was made by The Onion. And I was like, you know, I don't want to fall in those cliches and be what they are making fun of.
Yes. Oh man, it is so cool to hear how the genre has evolved and expanded. And you gave such great examples of work that is absolutely in the true crime category because people binge it because it's great storytelling. And it's that escape or that up closeness we get to death that we're all craving that also accomplishes these other things, like a deeper examination of our criminal justice system. Serial to me would be another example. I had Rebecca Lavoie on from Crime Writers on, and she was,
love her.
Yeah, she's the best. But she was like, do you think the average American woman, like on her power walk, be knowing like what a Brady violation is, if not for Serial? And I agree. Like it gave us this whole new access to courtroom dialogue and what happened to Adnan and to really go deeper in that. So yeah, it can accomplish so much. So it's exciting that some of that had been laid out prior to you telling the story. And the story just explores all the things we're talking about while being a compelling, worthwhile story in and of itself because of who Relisha is. And that's also something you do. How is it important to you to kind of convey the little girl Relisha?
What drew me to the story was the emotional aspect. I think of Relisha, and I identify with her because I was once a little black girl. There's this the most iconic photo of her it's a black and white photo. She has her hair in braids with barrettes. And I just think of the care that it takes to do a little girl's hair. Like I remember getting ready for school, sitting like in between my mom's legs, her detangling, braiding, putting on barrettes. And it's like, oh my gosh, I see the barrettes that goes in little black girl's hair and I can hear the laughter. I can smell the cocoa butter. I feel the skinned knees from playing on the jungle gym. Like that was me. I know what it is. And so keeping that emotional heart ended up being really important. And of course, the more I interviewed her family, the more I realized they had their own traumatic stories. I think of Relisha's stepfather, Antonio Wheeler, and I went in to be like, okay, what was Relisha like? Like, what was her favorite food? What were all these different things like? And we ended up talking and finding out that part of the reason this touched him so much is because being a father and keeping his family together and keeping his kids out of foster care was really important because he grew up in foster care. Mm-hmm. And the reason he grew up in foster care is because his stepfather murdered 2 of his siblings, and then he ended up in the foster care system. So it was really important to him to like be a father figure, keep his family together, all those things. And then this happens. And it's like it's the exact thing he wanted to avoid. The exact thing. Like if you text or call him right now, because you have to keep up with your sources. They're people, and you wonder how he's doing. He's like, the number one thing, he's like, I'm fighting for my kids. I want custody of my kids. I want to at least be able to like see and visit my kids and know how my children are doing. And keeping that sort of thing at the emotional heart and center of the story was very good at grounding it. And it was very helpful to me to realize, like, okay, there's all this policy and all these different things going on. And yes, that's important, but there is an emotional center to the story, and keeping that as the focus.
Yeah. And that is what will like hopefully hook a person in and keep them. What do you think though of people? I mean, how do I phrase this? What we're talking about is, who the media does spend more time on. And it brings me to this question that is kind of the driving question of the series right now, is which is coming first? Is the media reflecting back to us our values of who we value and who we deem worthy of victims that we're going to pay attention to and care about? Or is it the other way around? Is it something inherent in us that's the media's responding to? Are they telling us, or are we influencing them?
Yeah, I think it's both. It's a little chicken or egg, because
definitely
on one hand, I think, like, I work in a newsroom, and I know that the number one thing an editor or a manager or any other thing, like, you'll pitch something and they'll be like, okay, but like, what's the hook? How do we get the listener invested? Or what's the peg? Like, and a lot of it, and it's my least favorite question, because, and granted, this could be me wanting to just do whatever I want to do, but I'm like, do we really need a peg? But journalism 101 will be like, your story needs to be relevant. And for a lot of stories, the relevance is the quote unquote relatability.
Right.
And then you're looking like, who is your audience? And I think on one hand, people have been, I think it's a mixture of socialization and just how people are. People want to relate to something. Like, the reason I did the story, Relisha's braids. Like, I should not say that is, her braids are not the sole reason I made a podcast, but like, there is a relatability. It captivated there.
You. Yeah.
But at the same time, we should be able to sympathize and empathize with people who aren't exactly like us, who come from different backgrounds. I also think about the way news looks. It's diversifying, but it kind of makes me think of Ukraine. Like, there's a conversation around Ukraine where it's just like, okay, what's happening there is terrible. Why is that getting more attention right now? Or like, why is that getting more attention than, say, the hunger crisis in Afghanistan? 95% of Afghans, food instability, are starving. It is a crisis, a financial crisis, a food crisis. It's terrible. Like, the Taliban said they were going to reopen schools for boys and girls. They are not reopening schools for girls. It's awful there. And it's this idea of like, okay, we can hold two things in our minds at once. We can see that two things are terrible at once. But the reason, I think part of the reason, and people have said this about Ukraine, there have been like even journalists who have said like, oh my gosh, they look like me. And it's like, well, they don't look like me. I more so look like in Mali or Ethiopia, where there are also like humanitarian crises happening. And so I think it's a mixture of the two. And I think newsrooms need to diversify, but also as people who create, we need to think, okay, wait a second. Why is it that this story is getting more attention than another story? Like, even I think of Relisha's case and I wonder, like, live in DC, used to be Chocolate City. It's considerably less chocolate now. But even if Relisha, still Black, came from more money, would it be a different, like, if she, instead of disappearing from Southeast DC, she disappeared from Shaw or the 16th Street Heights or somewhere in Ward 3, would there have been more attention? And would people have noticed sooner? Likely.
Yes.
So.
I mean, I can almost say definitively yes, because we've seen kidnapping stories of white suburban middle class girls from those families. and the whole nation knows, and the whole country didn't know about this. Everything you're saying is like really sinking in, and I'm going to need to process for days. But the relatability factor, it's like, well, relatable to whom?
Exactly.
Right? Like, and it's me. I know that. And so then I just struggle so much with like what to do with that once you have that understanding and awareness. And true crime is another example. I keep kind of making this comparison because I think it sticks. This is a very female dominated genre. And I would say of those women, I don't know the stats on race. I do know the stats between genders is like the disparity is huge. It's women. But from what I see anecdotally, it's more white women. And so the relatability is a reflection of the dominant consumer.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, exactly. I think there are plenty of podcasts and conversations. And I think part of the reason that true crime has been dominated by white women for so long is also that framing. It's this idea of like, oh, the police are great and they will fix it and it's going to be fantastic. When we know that like police are a source just like anyone else. For a long time, journalists would fact check and they'd be like, oh, if the police, like you kind of take what they say as fact. But I think we're finally in a place where it's like, oh, we need to be critical of everyone, even if it's a city entity or a government entity. And I think, and of course, there have been so many stories of sex workers who have gone missing and been murdered and, they get less attention from the police because it's like, oh, run away. I'm like, oh, of course, like the transient and stable.
Risky lifestyle.
Exactly. And I think too, it would not surprise me if a lot of people of color have not really taken on to true crime in a way that they could. Just because it's like, okay, well, my experience with the justice system is different. It's just different. And so the framing is different. And granted, I do think the framing is changing. I think of Finding Cleo and like the stories of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Like those kind of stories are getting more and more attention. And I think it's a good thing. It's bringing more and more people on. Cause I think what appeals about true crime, at least like in my mind, and maybe this is like an anxiety thing, but I'm just like, oh, if I hear, like, I think of the show I Survived, like you hear stories of women. You hear stories of women who are like kidnapped and get away. And so I think part of it is listening and like, okay, if someone gets me, I know if they put me in zip ties, how to move my wrists so I can get out, or like, I know the proper precautions I can take. And I think that's part of the major draw of true crime. It's being like, okay, how do I not get myself in this situation? So it's also that thing of like, okay, no matter what is said, if I am arrested, I did not do it. Even if I did do it, I will not speak to police. I want my lawyer on hand. They're going to say, hey, it makes you look guilty. That's fine. Me and my lawyer will talk about it. Until then, silence. Bye. Okay. All right. I'll be here quietly. Like, it's just that kind of like, it's people learning how to protect themselves from everything now.
Self-protection. I hear this from almost every woman I've spoken to in over 100+ episodes. It's like, I'm hoping that I'll learn something that could save my life potentially. And, this is maybe the one part of the true crime aspect that transcends, the things that are different about us in terms of race and socioeconomics is that the Margaret Atwood quote, which is men are afraid women will laugh at them and women are afraid men will kill them. Yeah. Kind of like that's what motivates us, right? Some statistics came up from your show and one was in cases of missing Black children. Can you talk about the differences, some of the statistics around those cases that struck you?
Yeah, of course. So nationally, Black children make up about 14% of the population of children, which makes sense. Overall, Black people are 13% of the United States population, but they make up about a third of missing children's cases, which is just a crazy, crazy disparity. The good news is a lot of the times, especially in DC, people are found. So I want to say there's like a 90% or more rate of the police locating people in DC when they've gone missing, which is phenomenal. Huge. And I think that's what made Relisha's story so interesting because kids get found. And a lot of the times, children may run away, which is a thing where it's like people don't take it as seriously, but at the end of the day, that's still a child, not where they're supposed to be. And it should be taken seriously.
Yes.
Or, it's a custody thing. Maybe one parent extends visitation without permission, or a grandparent picks up their kid from school and like runs off. So it's different, but yeah, it's really crazy how there are fewer Black children, but more go missing. Right. There's a real disparity there.
What do you suggest listeners of your podcast and sort of these more thoughtful true crime enthusiasts do after hearing a show like yours and ones like it without we had a conversation last week with my guest about performative justice, which is icky, right? But sometimes feels like the awkward first step of engaging a subject. What's like an authentic, sustainable thing people can do once they know something they didn't know before? Because we can't care about what we didn't know about. What would you hope?
Yeah, I think of Relisha's case in particular, and the way I describe it a lot of times, it's like it's a true crime podcast, but it's a Trojan horse to talk about childhood poverty and homelessness. And one of the people that I spoke with said, we know what we need to do. There just needs to be the political will to do it. And I do hope that people walk away from my podcast with the political will. So I think of the fact that Relisha's family was evicted, and that's what put them in the shelter, in an awful shelter. And I think, there are changes to be made to eviction laws. There are policies to be put in place when it comes to shelters. And I will say DC, in the wake of it, closed that shelter, and now they have smaller family shelters in every ward across the city. But even that had some fight back against it. I think of the NIMBYism, the not in my backyard. The shelter in my ward, it's the wealthiest ward in the city. And, they had like an outdoor space, and they wanted to be like, oh, let's make the patio a little bigger so families can like be outdoors. And there was a big fight against it where people were like, no, this will raise crime. This is terrible. Or, the idea of building affordable housing in neighborhoods, or even just like housing in general, because there's a housing shortage. Like even folks who are middle class, like it's hard to buy a house right now. Like people got to go in like millions of dollars in cash to get a home in places where that was not happening. And so then you imagine someone living below the poverty line with a lot of children, it's even harder. And so just like that political will to be like, wait, stop. Yeah, okay, I don't like the way apartments may look in my historical neighborhood, but is this a way that's going to fight childhood poverty and homelessness? Like, would building those apartments actually make that difference? And just thinking more holistically and thinking like, okay, what are the consequences of the things I'm saying yes to and the things I'm saying no to? And what kind of world am I trying to build for me and the people around me?
Beautiful. Thank you for that. I'm sure you do, think about Relisha now and the man she was last seen with. For listeners, if you haven't listened to Through the Cracks, go back immediately when we're done talking and listen. I don't want to give everything away, but there's a lot of presumptions of what's happened to her. Mm-hmm. Do you have a working theory that you go to in your mind when you think about her?
Yeah, it's a mix. I go back and forth. Just thinking statistically and likelihood, it's being optimistic does not feel realistic. But then there's another part of me, and it's interesting because I spoke with a former Metropolitan Police officer, and I would ask everyone, like, what do you think happened? And he was almost hoping, he's like, I almost hope that she's no longer with us, because like, if she is, like, that might be a fate that's worse than death. But part of me is like, I don't know, maybe she's somewhere out there. And I think she'd probably be about 16 now, about to be 16. Part of me would like to think that she plays soccer with her friends, and, she's like, she has like a homecoming date or a prom date or like a crush on somebody, or like, she's like, ugh, I have to navigate geometry. Like that's my least favorite subject, but maybe she loves art, because I remember the Project Playtime folks said that like she loved color, like the art projects were her favorite things. And so part of me would like to believe, part of me still holds out hope that that's where she is and that she's okay.
Yeah, of course. And Through the Cracks second season, is that going to happen? Are you working on it? Is there anything you can tell us about it?
Yeah, so hopes are that there will be a second season. We're actually figuring out what it's going to be now. So doing a little bit of reporting here and there on a few different subjects. There was a serial killer in the DC area very long ago that targeted Black women and girls. But there's also,
I know about that.
It's a really crazy story. It's really crazy. And then on the other hand, there was an alternative school that was ceremoniously closed and really, really impacted the lives of the children that were attending there. And, there have been different outcomes from different students, like some are doing fine, some aren't, and just kind of exploring like, okay, is that a safety net that fell through? So there are lots of different options that we're looking at for the second season.
Well, we look forward to seeing what you choose and what you put out. We'll certainly be listening. I can't thank you enough for killing the small talk and being on Dialogue. I will point everybody to Through the Cracks and to your media. Thank you so much for being on.
Thank you.
Dialogue is a Yellow Tape Media production, audio engineered by Jason Usry and produced, hosted, and edited by me, Rebekah Sebastian. If you love the podcast, please consider becoming a diehard by signing up at patreon.com/dialogue. Other ways to support the show, follow along on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across platforms, and you can now watch most episodes on YouTube by subscribing to my channel, Rebekah Sebastian. For more information or to drop me a note, visit RebekahSebastian.com. Until next time, thank you for listening and killing the small talk.